Game over, man. Game over.
Johnny. You're gonna need a bigger boat. So serious. Roll out.
I am Iron Man.
This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the InSession Film Podcast.
Welcome to the new podcast presented by the female film critics of InSession Film. We are speaking, we love movies, we are women in session. I'm Kristin Battestella at Therefore Review. Joining me tonight is Zita Short of the 300 Passions podcast. We've been feeling a lot of love recently at InSession Film. It's been Women's Month here as we're working and International Women's Day. We had a lot of tweets and loves and likes and reshares and all that magic algorithm stuff, which was funny because it was for that hated Best Picture nominees episode that we were getting so much love, right? That was really nice. So we wanted to say thank you if we have anybody listening out there in the ether. We've spoken a lot about some of our classic ladies' favorites, our contemporary ladies' favorites. Tonight we're actually going to talk about director, predominantly known as a director, Sydney Pollack. And Zita, I wanted to start right off because a lot of people, I feel like, probably would not recognize him by name, which seems weird to me to say. And I'm surprised that he's forgotten or underappreciated for yet having such acclaim and awards nominations. What is it about a Sydney Pollack film that keeps him in mind for you?
Well, I was interested in discussing him because he's one of those filmmakers who's definitely dismissed as sort of a middle-brow hack by a lot of critics, and he doesn't fall into that sort of auteur bracket. He's not characterized as someone with a distinctive touch. And I've already whined and moaned about some of the limitations of the auteur theory in previous episodes, but I do find it odd how the perception of certain filmmakers causes critics to give them the benefit of the doubt in certain cases or to be sort of merciless in others. And I personally feel as though Pollack is a better filmmaker than a lot of directors who are classed as auteurs or great directors or filmmakers with something fresh and new and exciting to say. I would put him on the same footing as someone like Jonathan Demme, who seems to be far more popular with modern cinephiles, who gets all this credit for having this distinctive voice. And I feel as though he's characterized in that manner because he has a background in making exploitation films. He has this link to Roger Corman, and before he got into making these prestige pictures in the 90s, he made a couple of films that were gritty and down and dirty and had the sort of stamp of authority from someone like Corman. Whereas someone like Sydney Pollack begins his career as a mainstream studio director. And so there isn't the same appeal there. He is not perceived as someone who has something important and shattering and groundbreaking to say, and is treated as this hired hand throughout his career. And I find it frustrating. On some level, I understand that analysing the career of a director who has these very clear thematic preoccupations that run throughout their work and who introduces a lot of the same visual motifs into a lot of their films, it does make sense that it's easier to draw links between their different works and to comment on how their perspective on a certain issue might have evolved over time, and to consider how they adapted to new technological innovations. At the same time, I think it's unfair to completely dismiss a filmmaker like Pollack. And if we are going to have middle-brow cinema, and we're always going to have middle-brow cinema. I would be very thankful if any of the filmmakers working today in that field were as skilled as craftsmen as he was. I think you look back at a lot of films that he made during the 70s and 80s that received tepid reviews, that received a lukewarm response, and they are just so far beyond a lot of what we get today in terms of quality, in terms of the degree of personal investment on display. And I'll get into it further, but I think he doesn't get enough credit for his ability to work with movie stars and to deal with the baggage that comes along with the image and the iconography of a Robert Redford without allowing it to overpower the films that he made.
And we'll be bouncing around here as we're talking about different films going around, not necessarily chronologically. In fact, I feel like Pollack is almost a director that it's more intriguing to look at backwards, because I think a lot of his films in the 90s are not the worst, but is it a generational issue? Because if you were somebody who saw his films in the 70s when you were young, it's like, wow, I'm blown away. But then if you were somebody that the same age, budding age in the 90s, and you saw something like Random Hearts, you'd be like, who is this director? This is stinky, as opposed to, I remember, it's so funny. When we were complaining about Places in the Heart, I feel like the same tape had This Property is Condemned on it. And I remember seeing that as a kid and being like, this is a really heavy movie. And this is made in the 60s. Like, whoa, okay. And the irony of that, I feel, comes full circle, because that Jeremiah Johnson gif of Robert Redford that people thought was Zach Galifianakis, like I feel like there's part of Pollack that's in the collective consciousness that is positive and negative, which seems backwards to me, because I think the 3 Days of the Condor is, exceptional. And it's frustrating. What you're right, when you see things today that are so tepid and running through the motions, and you think, no, this is how you do an espionage thriller.
And you do notice, obviously, looking through his filmography, it is more difficult to draw a link between these films than it is with the oeuvre of Hitchcock. And I suppose that means that centering this episode around the director himself could be slightly more difficult. At the same time, I like the fact that he displayed such versatility as a filmmaker, and no two films that he made were alike. And I happen to enjoy that. And I say that as a guilty admission. I know that you're meant to love the fact that so many of Hitchcock's films do seem so similar in so many regards. I can't bring myself to be one of those people. And maybe I'll get there one day, but so far, I'm not fully on board. But in circling back around to what you were talking about, I do think it's fair to say that he's almost presented in the 70s as an enemy of independent cinema. I think we look back on that period of Hollywood history, and you have Coppola and Scorsese and Cassavetes and all of these important filmmakers who are dealing with transgressive subject matter and trying to formally experiment and push the medium forward. And they are seen as these radical innovators who were attempting to alter the nature of film itself. And I think it would have been very easy, especially at the time, to dismiss Pollack, who definitely makes studio films, and to say, well, 3 Days of the Condor, it's this mainstream version of something like The Conversation with all of the rough edges sanded off. It's enthralled to the beauty of the movie stars who appear in it. It's not as dark in its tone. It's not as bleak. It's not as suggestive about American corruption. It doesn't draw as strong of a parallel to the various Richard Nixon controversies. I'm going to say primarily Watergate, but there were also other controversies swirling around him at that time. And yet, again, I do think these are films of an unusually high quality. And the film of his that probably enjoys the most cultural cachet with people who like to consider themselves cinephiles and who see themselves as being above that middle brow pabulum is probably They Shoot Horses, Don't They?, which is his most overtly bleak film. And I admire it greatly. I do think it's a great film. I think it presents his filmmaking talents on full display. It's a rendering of a story that could very easily seem inert, but it does have a certain dramatic power in his hands. He succeeds in distancing you from a lot of these characters, in desentimentalizing a lot of scenes that could have seemed soggy and overly sentimental in the hands of another filmmaker. Very good performances, of course. These are all of the things that were talked about at the time. And I know this sounds like faint praise, but it's just a very well put together film. Everyone who worked on it was firing on all cylinders. And I think that really counts for something at the end of the day. At the same time, I think it's far too easy to present that film as, oh, well, that was his zenith as a real artist. That's when he was making bleak, challenging films. And then, over the years, he sells out. And if you look at his later filmography, it's all crap. It's this trash that's intended to appeal to middle-class housewives. It's not shocking anyone. He's not doing anything interesting with the actors in his films. And that really gets on my nerves. Yes, They Shoot Horses, Don't They? Is raw and gritty in a way that Tootsie isn't. But I still think that Tootsie wouldn't necessarily benefit from featuring grainy Haskell Wexler cinematography, and the lack of realism on display in a lot of those performances is effective. You don't need Jane Fonda tearing her hair out on screen in that film. And I get frustrated when people present that as his one great achievement and then view the rest of his career as this slow decline.
I love when you start doing this slightly other voices of these Nelly naysayer kind of out there people who are just, it doesn't make sense when people say silly things like that. They Shoot Horses, Don't They? Did have a lot of the art and costume editing, all the extra kind of awards. It is a well-packaged kind of film. And the thing that I like about Pollack is that he worked in all these different genres. He wasn't specializing in this is my shtick and continuing to try and reinvent that same shtick across the decade. To me, it was more, give me this subject, a drama, psychological, a thriller, a romance comedy, and I can work with it. I can make something that's going to get acclaim, and I really love and appreciate that. They Shoot Horses, Don't They? I do want to briefly, that was like 71, I guess, awards. That was the year of Oliver.
1969.
69?
No, it wasn't the year of Oliver. It was the year of Midnight
before.
Cowboy.
Okay.
No, Oliver was 1968.
Okay, I'm way I get confused. Yeah, that was Midnight Cowboy. Okay, that year, but it was not nominated for Best Picture.
Yes, and it holds the record for having the most nominations without getting a Best Picture nomination.
I went through this with Amy Thomason in our previous episode because we now I forget what we were discussing. Maybe it was the Wild Bunch when we said, which again, it came up in our most hated nominees. Hello, Dolly over the Wild Bunch. No. So that was a year where, questionable kind of things, I suppose. I don't know. But it won supporting actor.
It did, yes. And you have obviously the infamous, horrible story connected to that. So, and I assume everyone knows about the murder-suicide, so we don't have to get into it, but just awful.
Susanna York was also nominated. Screenplay based on material, but yeah, Midnight Cowboy sweeping things. I think that was the year of being edgy, of having titles that sound like they're Westerns, but they're not Westerns. Midnight Cowboy, they shoot horses, don't they? He did the Westerns with Jeremiah Johnson. And it's kind of funny because I also do think of his couple cameo moments as an actor, but I do kind of feel like he is an actor's director, that he can really work with someone well and draw something out. And when you were doing that little naysayer bit about the 3 Days of the Condor, that's not what you really believe, right? I love 3 Days of the Condor. Tell me you love it as well.
I don't think I'm quite as enthusiastic about it as you are, but I do think it's an example of very solid Hollywood filmmaking from that period. You have the beautiful, rich cinematography. You have the famous Faye Dunaway sex scene where he's cutting to black and white photographs amidst the lovemaking. You have the famous ending. And Max von Sydow, if that's how you pronounce it, is very good in the movie. Those are the sort of pleasures that you can get out of mainstream filmmaking. And I know I sound cruel and reactionary when I say this, but there is a part of me that thinks there's something appealing about that. I know it sounds like I'm being anti-intellectual and I'm suggesting that people should have to settle for less, but I like the warmth and the comfort of watching a big studio film that is very handsomely mounted and richly photographed. And not every movie needs to look like a Samuel Fuller film. That there is a place in the film industry for Hollywood studio gloss, for as much as some people might claim that there isn't.
It was big for its day. It was popular, but I feel today, I guess, if we're looking at the back view lens, we get in the opposite. Not everything has to be a blockbuster. When there was just this news about Netflix giving $130 million for a rom-com, and you're like, why? What do you do with that much money for a rom-com? I like that the 3 Days of the Condor shows that you can have a mainstream hit that's still thrilling. It was 1975, but to me, it does feel like a 70s movie, but in some ways it doesn't, because to me it still hits. And I just say to people, just watch like the first that opening 15 minutes, because it's very taut. There's very little dialogue. You're just getting in this routine setup of these research kind of spies, and and this terrible things happen, and it's just really taut, and you're immediately hooked. And then when you get into sweeping Faye Dunaway by stealing her Jeep, kind of embroiled in all this, it's just, you're along for the ride. And I think it's really entertaining. I feel like we've forgotten how to do that, a mainstream film that just is a really taut quality film.
And you reference the fact that he's also noted for his work as a character actor. And oddly, I feel as though when most people bring him up nowadays, it is for his work in either Eyes Wide Shut or Husbands and Wives. Those are his most acclaimed performances. He is incredible in both of those films, fully deserves the credit. But it is fascinating that this person who was, in his heyday, mostly renowned for being a director, was seen as someone who would occasionally take on an acting role. has now risen to fame in a different capacity. And I guess another thing about his career is that he's also relatively prolific as a producer. He seems to have sort of played a part in setting up a lot of productions in addition to directing his own films. So I think that just furthers the perception of him as kind of a Hollywood phony, someone who's very into the business side of things. And I know there are people out there who love the tortured artists fighting against the system, and he really doesn't fit that mold.
I like that outside of the box. I mean, again, we come through the opposite where we think, oh, somebody who's an actor who ends up, directing themselves and then they become a distinguished director. Like that's kind of the path we follow. And some of that we expect and we approve of it. And other times we kind of chuckle like, oh no, this person's not that good of an actor. Now they think they can direct type of thing. So I think it's interesting. He was a director. Then he started doing small roles. And I think that his production work in the 90s and, I guess early 2000s is better than his directing at that time. And again, the same thing where normally actors kind of create their own kind of like production kind of LLCs and they end up making films for themselves, where to me that is more of, oh, that's you selling out in Hollywood when you think you're going to be the actor, the director, and the producer of your own kind of film, where that's when I see somebody and I'm kind of like, yeah, okay, like, no. And it's so funny. I've mentioned this before because we spoke about Death Becomes Her before. I love his couple minutes in Death Becomes Her. I think it's just a perfect, like, little mini capsule of like the satire of the film. She's dead. He's examining her. Do you feel this? Do you feel that? There's no pulse. He's like, you're dead. I don't believe it. He's completely shocked. And Bruce Willis, bless him, he runs out into the waiting room when she comes back. He comes back and her body's gone. And in the waiting room, there's like snotty people with like scuffed knees and tennis rackets. And it's like a really posh, like fancy looking hospital. And it's the idea of this is Hollywood. This is what equates an emergency. And all the staff are rushing kind of behind Bruce Willis because he turns around and they're doing like the paddles to the doctor who's dropped at like the shock of what he's discovered with Meryl Streep being undead. And it's just this whole kind of within wink. And I don't think anybody else could have come in and done these few moments, and it's so funny to think of, oh, he has such a claim. And that's one of the things that I always adore and remember, like those little moments in Death Becomes Her.
And I think it's important to note from the very beginning of his career, he does have this very strong attachment to certain film stars. He received a lot of professional opportunities early on because he was a good friend of Burt Lancaster, who had been a film star for 2 decades by the time he reached the mid-1960s. But if you've ever read up on his personal life, you'll be aware of the fact that he began to suffer from alcoholism around this period. I believe he divorced his first wife and entered into a relationship with a woman who abused him. It was a very tough period of his life and career, and there are a lot of stories about him getting directors fired because he had disputes with them. And it sounds like he and Sydney Pollack had a relatively warm friendship, even though there's a huge disparity in terms of the amount of power that Lancaster has over him at that point in time. But from there, he does manage to build up a decent amount of goodwill. He directs The Slender Thread, starring Anne Bancroft and Sidney Poitier, which seems like it was designed to serve as sort of Oscar bait and didn't quite get there. So that movie doesn't really hit. you have This Property is Condemned in 1966, which is sort of an odd case because I feel as though it came out too late. It's one of those movies that was the last in this booming trend of Tennessee Williams plays getting adapted. And by 1966, when you start to see, say, films influenced by the French New Wave coming out that do start to feature nudity and more suggestive, titillating content, a lot of Tennessee Williams's work starts to look dated. Back in 1951, that was incredibly hot and sexy, and everyone wanted to go see A Streetcar Named Desire. But by 1966, I think it's seen as a bit too safe to really get anyone riled up. And so that isn't quite as big as it could have been. And then he really starts to, as you noted, hit his stride with They Shoot Horses, Don't They? And of course, that is the film that sort of allows Jane Fonda, who was already a very big name, very well known as a celebrity, but did have a tough time of it getting respect from the American press for her abilities as an actress, her scandalous relationship with, I think it's Roger Vadim, was extensively covered by the press. I believe she was mocked in France when she did appear in French language productions for not being very good at the language. And she infamously appeared nude on a poster in Times Square. So she had been this target of ridicule for several years. And then this film really turned things around for her. She was finally seen as this legitimate actress with real talent. People stopped comparing her so often to her father, the legendary Henry Fonda. And so it really does give her career that boost. And then even after that, Robert Redford, who he had already worked with in 1966, sort of becomes his main collaborator during this period. They make Jeremiah Johnson together. They make The Way We Were and 3 Days of the Condor. And then even later on, you have Out of Africa, which is probably or arguably their most successful film. It wins Best Picture. Pollack wins Best Director, even though, and people like to point to this movie as a film that's overrated and, oh, we look back on it and isn't it dreadful? And how could the people not notice at the time that it was bad? And I feel as though it's a bit of historical revisionism, because you read plenty of reviews from the time that are scathing. Not everybody was won over by this film. Plenty of the critiques that people make today were made back then. So you're not being radical or edgy when you suggest that this film is not quite as good as people seem to think it is. And I'm just going to have to come out with it. I like Out of Africa. And I know that this is an unpopular opinion nowadays. I understand why it is. Look, you can dislike it all you want. I have heard plenty of legitimate, very well-reasoned, convincing criticisms of it. Do not come to me pretending that you are the first person to realise that this film might be a bit sappy and actually it isn't as deep as it pretends it is. I feel as though people do not give it enough credit for using Robert Redford's star persona in a really fascinating manner. And my whole thesis with the film, which is typically interpreted as this kind of one-dimensional romantic fantasy. Meryl Streep is a Danish baroness and she leaves cold, unforgiving Denmark to move to warm, sunny Africa, where she can experience exoticism in person for the first time. And then she and Robert Redford have this very Mills and Boonish love affair. And you watch the film, and I always find it interesting that his character is so cold and untouchable, and he is this golden boy, but you can't quite reach him. And this is not unique in the romance genre. Obviously, you have a long tradition of Gothic novels about Mr. Rochester or Mr. Darcy or any of those heroes who initially appear to be cold and brooding and forbidding. But one of the fascinating things about the film is that she never gets through to him. Usually there's a point in these movies where he goes, wow, you really understand me. You're different from all those other women. And now I'm going to deliver a big trauma dump and talk about the fact that my mother was murdered when I was a child, and so that's why I am the way I am. And in this movie, he doesn't open up at any point. He very much remains emotionally distant from her, does not want to commit to her, wants to maintain casual relationships with many women. And it's interesting because the film, in many regards, is not on her side. And you would typically expect that for a film like this, which is definitely aimed at middle-class women, I will admit, you would usually assume that it's a film about how the love of this good woman redeems this man, and she gets to teach him how to be a proper husband, and then at the end they get married and settle down together. And so much of the film is her character kind of being bossy, and the movie calls her out for it. She has this deep desire to own the land and to boss other people around, and also to dictate how their relationship functions. She sort of wants him to be a kept man in many regards, which stands in conflict with the fact that she is clearly very excited by the idea of having an affair with him. Because at the beginning of the film, she gets married to a Swedish aristocrat, and he turns out to be a lout. He gives her syphilis because he's been having affairs with other women. And then she runs off with Robert Redford, who woos her very briefly, really puts on the charm. And I find it fascinating that the movie points out that there is this sort of irreparable contradiction involved in her attraction to these men. On the one hand, she does want him to be fresh and exciting and unknowable and ever so slightly emotionally unavailable. But then she also demands all of these things from him that would destroy that mystique and that allure and bring him crashing back down to earth. And so there is this question of, does this woman really want love? She claims to want that. She claims that she's all about settling down and getting married and living properly as the good people do. But in reality, she seems to have very little interest in actually doing any of the things that would allow someone to maintain a relationship like that. And the film ends on an unconventional note in that they don't make up. They break up because she is pissed off at him for not following her demands. And he says, well, okay, then I have various other lovers. We don't have to see one another anymore. And she is tearful about it. She's upset. But it also felt relatively mature in my eyes, in that this is not a film in which she threatens to kill herself when he leaves her. she's not utterly devastated. Her life isn't over. And it sort of ends on this emotionally muted note because he ends up dying while he's out flying. And that had been one of the great romantic adventures. He took her up in the biplane and they looked down at all of the sights in Africa. But she's clearly horrified when he dies and is deeply upset by it. But I was intrigued by the fact that the film really doesn't render any of that in overly melodramatic terms. It sort of arrives at this point where she has fully processed their breakup and the fact that he, on some level, did not want to be with her and their relationship could not last in the long term. And yet she still has these fond memories of him. And there is this ambiguous note in her final monologue about their relationship. So sorry, I went off for several minutes there. JD, you can edit this down. I'm very sorry to all of the listeners, but I think it's a great movie and I will not apologize.
It's okay. I remember the first time I saw it thinking that it got kind of disappointing at some point. Like I don't think is it that long? Is it over 2 hours? But maybe
yes.
Yeah, I was like, I'm like, this is really dragging on for a lot of them going nowhere with this, which I mean, it's a whole separate topic to get into, like Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights. But I remember being disappointed in Jane Eyre that it starts out so gothic. And then you're just like, spoiler, he's got a horny wife in the attic, like big deal. I'm kind of like, okay, they get their kicks, go their separate ways. And we're still going on about this. It's kind of funny because it's Jeremiah Johnson, 3 Days of the Condor, Electric Horseman, Out of Africa. And they did Havana after, where I almost want to say Robert Redford was Sydney Pollack's muse. I don't want to say lucky charm or collaborator. And it seems strange to have, perfect man, Robert Redford, calling him a muse. But in Out of Africa, it is actually, in some ways, I feel like he is the female role and she is the masculine role. She wants her way. She's the elite aristocrat and he's the rough, rugged man. But I keep thinking of how many films today are where the woman has to keep coming back to the man. And like you say, like, oh, it's suicidal, it's weepy, or it's just so much back and forth. And it's the woman who cries and gets hurt or leaves or is the tragic figure. And, and it's the man who gets to move on. So, the dynamics, ironically, to me, seem kind of reversed. But I was thinking, isn't that on your 300 Passions podcast list?
Yes, it is. So I'll be very excited to cover it one of these days. And in terms of Robert Redford being his muse, I really do admire the fact that he allows Robert Redford to be a movie star. And the most common criticism of Redford is that he has limited range as an actor. He's this pretty boy, but he doesn't necessarily have the empathy on screen that other actors possess. There is a coldness to him. There is an awareness about the fact that he's sort of so beautiful that he does not have to try to charm people. They look at him and they are immediately won over and would do anything for him because he looks like that. And this is a criticism that is more commonly applied to pretty girls. So it is sort of a fascinating case. But I think that it helps with Pollack that he doesn't try to compensate for that. That is always an element of the characters that Redford is asked to play, that they are these gorgeous paragons of beauty. And often when they maintain relationships in these films, the women that they are with do not seem very satisfied. Yes, they're with this ridiculous-looking person who can be charming in his own way, but the movie definitely doesn't sell you, or these movies do not try to sell you on the idea that he's this perfect romantic partner. In many regards, it's difficult to be around a person for whom life is so easy, for whom people ask so little of him.
No, maybe that's why I come back to 3 Days of the Condor, because like I love when he's in the phone booth and he's trying to like call on the code and like report that like his entire section's been hit, and they're like, "What's your code name, please? You have to say your code." He's like, "I don't remember. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm just one of like the paper men. I'm not a field agent. I have no idea." And then he effectively kidnaps Faye Dunaway. She's like, "I have things to do. Are you going to leave my house? I can't answer my phone." So yeah, Pollack I think really plays into his strengths, and it's ironic. I feel like Out of Africa gets doubly hated because it wins Best Picture over The Color Purple and Witness. So then I find it ironic that I wonder, was Pollack trying to have Harrison Ford be like his new Robert Redford when they do the Sabrina remake and then Random Hearts, when you're like, okay, this doesn't work.
Perhaps. Then again, I think they are very different as actors. I have noticed that Harrison Ford seems to have a bigger male fan base, and I'm not saying that Robert Redford isn't popular with the fellas, but Harrison Ford is definitely seen as someone who's a bit ornery, who has more texture than Robert Redford, who again has this sort of airbrushed quality because nobody looks like that. And yet, when you have Harrison Ford on screen, I don't love him. I'm sorry. He's fine. I don't fully get it. But the thing that he is celebrated for is that he steps into these big studio pictures and he's kind of a smart aleck. He's a bit of a bad boy. He has a touch of, I don't give a fuck about him. I sort of hate that, the whole I'm too cool for school thing. Some people go nuts over it. And I would say that he doesn't work as well in those Pollack collaborations because those films are pitched at such an earnest level, and he does not successfully play into that tone.
You say it so politely, pitched at an earnest level. I would just say try hard. Like Sabrina, you're trying to be Humphrey Bogart. Like, okay. And again, I wonder if this comes back to a generational view, because women in the 70s loving Redford, sure, but the era where the men who loved Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid were always going to follow Robert Redford. The same way the people who saw Star Wars and Indiana Jones will probably always love Harrison Ford when they up to like Get Off My Plane, Air Force One. So it's ironic, like Witness is when he does something different. That's when he became like a serious actor there. Mosquito Coast, I think, was around the same time. And Pollack, I guess, is looking for his leading man but then you also have Absence of Malice. So I find it ironic that he wins for Best Director for Out of Africa. I don't think Out of Africa is his best film. Yeah, and I feel like it shows when you get like a real quality performance, like something Tootsie, some like Absence of Malice, as opposed to when I feel like you don't get it, like in something like Random Hearts. But then I don't know how The Firm I feel is more like what you're talking about when it's just, it's just a mainstream thriller that's fine, that's going through the motions, and it's Tom Cruise, another legal drama. Okay, you watch it a couple times, yeah, but I don't remember that much about it compared to I think there were other Tom Cruise legal films around that time too.
It's very kitschy, and it's not really a movie that I ride hard for, but there are a couple of grace notes in that film that really do stand out. You have the very briefly displayed developing relationship between David Strathairn's character, who is a convict, and Holly Hunter, who's this kooky Southern secretary. And they are so charming together. And again, coming back to his direction of actors, he is so good at utilizing star power. I feel as though Holly Hunter, yes, she's an Academy Award winner. She is a highly respected actress. But I do feel as though Hollywood did not do enough to capitalize on the fact that she definitely had the ability to be a great movie star. And I think you look back, and most of the films that we fondly remember when we talk about her are ever so slightly alternative. The Coen brothers are mainstream filmmakers, but Raising Arizona was not topping the box office in its year of release. And this movie, The Farm, really made me think, well, she should have had her own sort of fun legal thriller. And I guess she made Copycat, but that was not a good film. So I just wish she had been given more swings at the bat when it came to that genre.
But he's shrewd in that fans of the cast are always going to follow specific people. Is The Firm a better film than Absence of Malice? Absolutely not. But you're going to have all the people who are just going to, through Paul Newman's filmography, it's going to be checked off their list, even though it disappoints me to think that are there probably less people that have seen Absence of Malice than have seen The Firm. But then you get something like at the end of his career, like The Interpreter, not a good movie. I don't know that if I finished it all the way through, but you're always going to have people who are going to like, it's a Nicole Kidman movie, it's a Sean Penn movie, ergo I'm going to watch it. So I think he's smart in that way. Like we were saying, in some ways, some of these films give in to the mainstream. Today, I feel like Out of Africa probably would be in the same boat, that there'd be people who would absolutely fawn over it as a total period piece, epic, Oscar bait kind of film. And it would be all the acclaim, even if it only played.
No.
If nobody saw it, I'm sure that there would be old school critic people, Academy voters who would still love it.
I completely disagree. That film does not get made today. In this economy, absolutely not.
True.
No one is throwing down tens of millions of dollars to get a film like that made, even if it did win awards, which I'm highly dubious about. I don't think that you can make movies about colonialism anymore, even though I think that the film's perspective on that issue is far more nuanced than people give it credit for. It's just not getting made. There is no way. And even if it was, I feel as though, the critics that you reference, who were all over the place in the 80s, your Sheila Bensons, for example, they do not exist anymore. If you look at critics who write for mainstream publications, they tend to be young and hip and edgy because that's what they're chasing. And those are not the sort of people who endorse the nearly 3-hour-long epic about a Danish baroness traveling to Kenya.
Today, it would be half the budget. It would be half the runtime, but it would be, like we were saying, one of those like writer, producer, actors who it's their passion project. And they're just going to conveniently gloss all over all the colonial issues at work, any of the heavy things, but it's probably going to be slow and look pretty and would play in the art houses. And yes, there would be a certain people who would probably make it popular by the controversy of it or something. I don't know.
No, again, I think there is no way that a movie like this exists in the modern world. A couple of years ago, a film came out called The Promise, which cost a ridiculous amount of money to make. It was a sort of epic, sweeping romantic drama centered around the Armenian genocide, and nobody saw it. It did not come out in cinemas or came out in 12 cinemas in the United States. It starred Christian Bale and Oscar Isaac, who are both relatively big stars, but it does not exist. It was very controversial in terms of its handling of the historical atrocity at its center. And so I think that is what would happen if someone tried to make a Karen Blixen biopic today.
Because we were talking earlier when we started, the way he kind of pulls back from directing and kind of moves more into production and produces a lot of great things. I think Fabulous Baker Boys, Talented Mr. Ripley, Leatherheads is in there. I think Presumed Innocent, he produced Harrison Ford but didn't direct. Cold Mountain, again, Nicole Kidman, big names, Michael Clayton. But then I chuckle because you're saying, oh, we're arguing about colonialism or controversial movies, but then he also produced The Reader, which we've discussed before at our Kate Winslet, where it's kind of like, yeah, okay, are we supposed to feel we're supposed to like the Nazi chick? It's like, no, see, but that is 2008, and obviously I guess times have changed, of course, but it's like there are still those little things around here. I don't know. Is that based on a book?
Yes,
well?
it is a very acclaimed German novel, and I have not read it. From what I have heard from others, it is slightly more nuanced than the film, which aims for a full redemption of Kate Winslet's Nazi prison guard at the end of the film.
Because, it'd take a lot to actually scroll through and check out every single one of these, but I feel like a lot of the material that he does best is material that's based on other properties, book or play adaptations. I don't know. Because how much of this is the director and how much of it is when he's got the really great story that he's molding for Robert Redford's star power. I mean, the book is originally The 6 Days of the Condor, well, then the material is already there. You can't go wrong. But then I guess maybe when something is original or you're trying to stretch and change things and start to bend to the mainstream, that's when he runs into problems. And as a producer or a director more recently, I feel like, was he struggling with the system? I don't know.
I think this is always the debate, and my line on it tends to be, and I know the auteur theory is based around this idea that an auteur, no matter how much of a giant turd they are handed, they can polish it into something that is at least solid entertainment through sheer force of will, through the power of their specific distinctive touch. And I happen to disagree with that. There are plenty of acclaimed auteurs who have made dreadful films that they did not manage to redeem. And I would also say, if you're a filmmaker who happened to pick a great source material for your film, good on you. You have good taste, you have a good eye for material. And even if it is, say, the author or the playwright doing a lot of heavy lifting in that regard, you still came up with the idea to bring this story to the screen. You still managed to avoid interfering, which is something that a lot of people do. They get their hands on a good thing and they manage to mess it up by thinking, well, I can change this, and actually I'm smarter than this person. And then you end up with an adaptation of a novel that's a mess, that misses the entire point of the original piece of work. And so honestly, I don't see it as a criticism. I understand that for a lot of people, they want to believe that, being a director is this very pure profession. And I only support filmmakers who make movies where it's clear that they were the only person who had an impact on the creative decision-making behind this film. First of all, that's nonsense, because you're always making films by committee. There are always other people who are going to have an impact on the way that it turns out. At the same time, if you're a filmmaker who's very good at delegating tasks to others, I still think that's a skill in and of itself. And I don't subscribe to this whole notion that, movies that don't represent the pure vision of the filmmaker are lesser in some regard. I would rather watch a pretty solid movie made by a studio hack than Charlie Chaplin's A Countess from Hong Kong, which is, most people would agree, his worst film, even though he's meant to be one of the greats.
I'm kind of glad that Pollack never dabbled in writing, because it's funny, I've seen a lot of low budget horror films where it's been a writer and director, one and the same, just because the productions are so small, so cheap, and sometimes they're also the editor, the cameraman, and actor. And a lot of times that's what hurts the film, because I look at this and I say, if they did this instead of that, if this was just the rough draft and you got to get a bigger budget where you could give these people the time to correct some things, have an extra person there to really polish something and make something better, it would be so great. And I only thought it was a low budget horror problem. But then, we saw some of these epic big Star Wars movies, where writer and directors were, making messes of things. And now it's a whole move in television where there aren't writers' rooms. There's showrunners who are in charge, and you put things out and there's just one vision and that's it. And like, there's no room for nuance, for production molding or for a director. So I think it's interesting that you even see, even when he moved into production, there were still like the same kind of, I guess Clooney would have been his next kind of star maybe. But it's interesting that people were still coming to work for Pollack, that there was something that people did like and respect in the industry, even if at that point audiences had checked out.
Yes, and I think it gets back to the fact that he is very much a Hollywood mover and shaker. Whenever you read a book about sort of the history of the behind the scenes from the 80s or the 90s, there'll be these industry parties and he's always there. He's enormously respected. He's this eminent figure. And I would say that he had earned that position. But I think for a lot of people, it means that he seems like less of an artist because, oh, look at him. He's very much a part of this system, even though great art should be anti-establishment by nature.
I don't know, but when you get it right, you get it right. Although the irony is he was nominated for more things than for what he actually won. He only won for Out of Africa, which seems really unfair. I mean, again, because I love Tootsie. We could spend a whole separate episode talking about Tootsie, because I mean, that's a whole separate issue of, because, drag, you had like Benny Hill, where it was a mockery, making fun of it, and some Like It Hot is a whole different, another animal to even discuss that we adore. But I feel like Tootsie came from such a fine, genuine, lovely place, and I love that scene where he's talking with Dustin Hoffman. Notice she thinks you're gay, but you're not. But wait, she thinks you're lesbian. Dorothy's not a lesbian, and he asked me to marry him, but does he know you're gay? Like it's this level of banter and genuine and sincerity that kind of comes across. So to me, it's again ironic that you think, okay, Tootsie was not awarded, where you could say, was that slightly edgy because it was dealing with, I was a better man with you as a woman than I was as a man, having been with a woman, type quotes, compared to Out of Africa, which was, your general run-of-the-mill Oscar bait type of film. Seems unfair, I guess, the way, like you said, we revisionist what's considered edgy and what's not, but that's all relative, I suppose.
Yes. And I understand we certainly disagree over the Academy Awards and the decision.
Big shocker.
Yes. And I know that in 1985, you're a big The Color Purple person, and I'm certainly not. So obviously we are divided there.
Well, this is interesting. Again, you wouldn't think, the more we've discussed, it seems like sociology and film historians seem to kind of collide, because it's interesting perspective. The Color Purple, wonderful book. It is a wonderful film, but it's very heavy, very emotional, but obviously so American specific, where could you say Out of Africa with all of its colonialism is probably more pertaining similar to your history in New Zealand?
Well, it's an odd case if you bring in sociology, because my big issue with The Color Purple is that it feels very much like a story for African American women. The author of the novel is a Black woman, and she clearly feels a very intense pull to the issues and the themes that the story deals with. And you can sense that she has intimate knowledge of what it feels like to be a Black person in a society where people hate you because of the color of your skin, where people are prejudiced towards you, and to have to face that every single day, and to have to deal with just this unimaginable level of oppression. And then by the time it gets adapted in Hollywood, you have Steven Spielberg making the film. And I'm not one of those people who insists that every film about a minority group should be directed by a member of that minority group. But to me, it does seem pretty shocking that they did not hire an African-American woman to direct that film, because it's so specific to that group. And I do feel as though he renders so much of the midsection of that film in such broad strokes, it turns into a feel-good crowd pleaser. Even something like Close Encounters of the Third Kind is so much darker and so much more harrowing than this film is, in terms of how it deals with Richard Dreyfuss losing his mind in the middle of that film, his family abandoning him, essentially losing everything because of this encounter that he has had with alien species. And you watch The Color Purple, which is about the oppression of African Americans, which should be about the main character having to deal with repressing her sexuality and having this difficult, uncomfortable relationship with another woman who may or may not be a lesbian. Neither of them can be entirely sure, because they're trapped in this situation where they are both under the control of her husband, Mr. And if they step out of line, they know that they will have to face even more abuse. And so they want to share these moments of tenderness during the brief periods in which they are left on their own, but they cannot fully trust one another, and they are divided. You do not get any of that in the film. They erase all of the content that refers implicitly or overtly to the fact that they might be lesbians. It just feels as though he took this book and he stripped out everything that would be challenging for the audience. It is cinematic miserabilism that doesn't even get credit for being difficult to watch. When I see something like India Song, for example, another film about colonialism, you could say, and a woman who kills herself, as is revealed quite early on in the film, that movie messes you up. It is horrible to watch. You feel awful by the end of it, but you do get a sense of the weight and the gravity of the themes that it deals with. The Color Purple is designed to go down easily. It is designed for white people to watch it and to pat themselves on the back for understanding that, oh, isn't racism bad? And I don't feel as though it deserves the praise it receives.
So you're saying that it's guilty of what you were saying, where it's a mainstream film that pretends to be edgy.
Yes.
Because it's so funny, because Meryl Streep is nominated for Out of Africa, and Whoopi Goldberg is nominated for The Color Purple. Neither of them win, but it's ironic. I don't think it's one of the times that Meryl Streep deserved a nomination. Yeah, so it's kind of, and this is a whole separate issue I have with the Academy, of course, because we've had one Black Best Actress winner, but we have had 9 supporting actress winners who are Black. So it's like Hollywood loves to have we'll nominate the Black woman to effectively stay in her lane. That was a good performance because she stayed in her lane as the support. So it's kind of funny that we had that year. You're right. It's the white man who's elevating the Black woman, but the Black woman is going to be nominated on par with bitchy aristocrat Meryl Streep and Out of Africa. And you see the disparity, but then Geraldine Page wins for The Trip to Bountiful anyway, which
she's very good in that film. The movie is very much an acting showcase. She is a veteran performer. It was her 8th nomination. I think that she was deserving of the win.
I don't remember that movie at all. Which is what I said when we were complaining about, the hated Best Picture nominees, where it's like, if you can't recognize a film by name, was it worthy of a nomination? But the 80s for you. But yeah, and this was just out of the Reagan era, I guess. Spielberg was doing, I guess Temple of Doom was probably.
Well, this is
What
what mid Reagan.
Yeah.
We're right in the thick of it.
Yeah.
So
So Pollack going through the motions and getting all his acclaim finally, I guess, was just par for the course at the time.
I think that what he does with Out of Africa is, it's a difficult argument to make, because in the case of The Colour Purple, it's one of those movies where there is a lot of craft on display. My problem with that craft is that while it is aesthetically impressive, it does not suit the material. He does not have the right sensibility to tell this story. And so you do have, say, beautiful images of the landscape outside of their house. And you think, well, okay, I'm admiring this sunset. What does this have to do with the message or the emotional temperament of this story? It feels like a distraction. It feels tonally discordant. It's all out of whack. Whereas Out of Africa, a lot of people would say it's a less ambitious project. And I can somewhat understand that. But I do feel as though he gets closer to executing the story successfully. He does understand how to give you those grand shots of the landscape. And it counts for something in Out of Africa, because his directing style does not appear to be in conflict with the themes of the story.
So was Pollack shrewd enough that he started effectively small with making sure that he was honing the actors in his early films, comes up with his technically crowning achievement, Out of Africa, but then he was almost shrewd enough to know when to pull back and say, I'm going to be more of a producer, because then you could almost argue technically you would say he had more success as a producer later than he did as a director in his prime, which is kind of weird.
I wouldn't necessarily agree. He's a pretty big deal. You look at Tootsie and Out of Africa, both huge hits, blockbusters in their day.
Only ever remembered for Tootsie. That's fine by me. Yeah.
But I think it's fair to say that we definitely remember him for his producing credits. I think The Talented Mr. Ripley is a wonderful film. I really feel as though the people who accuse it of being too pretentious are kind of missing the point. But I'm a great appreciator of his work, if you can't tell at this point. And I am glad that we've had the opportunity to sort of talk this through, even if this episode ended up devolving into a discussion of the 1985 Academy Awards.
That's fine. You said you love Out of Africa. Is that one of your favorites?
Well, it depends what we're talking about. I suppose it's top 200 for me. I'm very fond of it, yes.
Wow. But is it your favorite? So then is it your favorite Sydney Pollack movie?
Yes, it is.
Do you have like a top 5? Because how do you break that down? Yeah, 5 director, a 5 producer.
Well, Out of Africa is certainly miles ahead of the others in terms of the amount of affection that I have for it as a piece of filmmaking. But I would also put They Shoot Horses, Don't They up there. And I would also have Tootsie in contention. I don't adore it, but it is one of his best films.
Yes, I love Tootsie. I'm not sure the order. I like Jeremiah Johnson. I feel like if I watched it today, it'd be boring, perhaps. But I remember being younger and just as it being like a cool Robert Redford Western, I liked it. And I love 3 Days of the Condor and Tootsie. So, to me, it's one of those, when I hear Sydney Pollack, I mean, I recognize him by name. I recognize his films by name. So it's surprising to me that to feel like now he's kind of, even, dare I say, slid into obscurity. Even if people remember those films, people are not likely to think, oh, they're the same director, or, oh, yes, they're in the Pollack pantheon. So I guess it's you realize that so many people have such a small window in Hollywood, to have, 30, 40, 50-year career is actually quite small in comparison. And a lot of his work maybe has not found today's audience, which is sad.
Yes. And again, I sort of regret this, but apparently I am this podcast's defender of middlebrow dreck. And I do have a fondness for this sort of thing. And I suppose it's similar to how you have plenty of cinephiles who love, say, trashy B-movies. And I guess their argument is, well, this is termite art. And what you're interested in is this white elephant art that is overly snobby and that will not stand the test of time and that has far too many pretensions and affectations attached to it. I sort of like the stodginess of these pictures. I cannot deny it. I have a certain nostalgic affection for this type of movie, and I hope that Hollywood keeps making them. I know they're meant to be a bane of cinema, and we're meant to root for all movies to be violent Quentin Tarantino-inspired thrillers that draw upon the oeuvre of Rossmeyer, but I'm quite happy with a couple of Meryl Streep vehicles coming out every year.
And the more things change, the more they stay the same. I mean, every time Tootsie is on, I have to stop and watch it because I love it. And we wouldn't be where we are today without what I would say groundbreaking films like that. But then you have Out of Africa, where I feel like you almost had a rebellion against it of like, these are the kind of, typical films that we hate. And then, 5 years later, you're getting things like Goodfellas. So you made me chuckle, here along comes Quentin Tarantino. So, and now we're back into this. It's ironic that it's swung the other way in that everything is popcorn, everything is nice and easy. And now we're getting this rebellion of like, stop, it's too much. So it's all cyclical. Thank you. In Hollywood, it all comes back. But is there a comparable director today?
Comparable. No, I wouldn't say there is, honestly. And I know people would scoff at that because we don't look at Sydney Pollack as an important voice in the cinema, but you do not have mainstream star vehicles anymore that center around Robert Redford and Barbara Streisand having a difficult relationship. It's very rare for a sort of weepy melodrama to be a big deal anymore. Yeah. And he specialized in that type of movie.
Yeah, dear listeners, if you can think of somebody, let us know. Because, you don't have anybody whose job it is to take any genre or to take any star and make something good out of it, and we've debated briefly before mentioning it, how in some ways it's back to a studio system. No, I'm a Marvel director, or the way we see people who are behind the scenes in Marvel who then switch to DC, like there's people who are specific all action or people who only do horror, where now it's specialization. And we've come down to such, I don't know, it gets kind of numbing after a while, as opposed to, as I said, I come back to Tootsie. Every time the 3 Days of the Condor, there are times when 3 Days of the Condor is on the live stream and I'll look at it and I'll be like, oh no, wait, it's past the beginning of the movie. You can't get into it now, but yet if I'll be like, oh no, 3 Days of the Condor is coming on. Yes, I have to start at the beginning. I love this movie. These are the kind of things that are memorable, that are worth coming back to. So it has been interesting discussing him. I'm glad you chose this topic, Miss Zita. But you hadn't written about Out of Africa, you said, yet?
I haven't. No, maybe I'll get around to it at some point. And clearly, if you've listened to me prattle on today, you can tell that I'm very passionate about it.
Do you have any final thoughts on Sydney Pollack?
Well, I'm glad that I have a forum to rave about him. And I do think it would be nice. I would appreciate it at least if people weren't quite so dismissive of him upon learning that he is not an auteur. I do think there is a place for directors of his ilk within the industry.
What are we calling this era now of the 70s or 80s? It's a whole other topic in itself, because it used to be, where was the line of classic films? And people would like arbitrarily say like 65 or 69. But now there's this whole wave of retro film. Go back and look at the non-auteur retro films, people.
Yes, I wouldn't necessarily classify him as a part of any one film movement. I think part of what makes him a mainstream filmmaker, you could say, is that he does have this ability to just keep going no matter what changes occur in the industry. And so from 1966 to 1989, he is able to sort of carve out this niche for himself.
Is Tootsie on the 100 Passions list?
I hope not.
Really?
Well, it's not a romantic movie. God, the way Jessica Lange gets treated is
True. I love that scene where they're in her room, and he's like, well, wait, if I could only just tell you. And she's like, no, maybe I have these urges too, but no, please. And then she goes to pick up the phone, and he's like, no, that's a corn cob. Like, again, that it's charming banter, but it's all the mistaken kind of farce, and there's the gender bending of it. So yeah, I feel like if I don't know, it be romance if you look at it through a different lens, maybe, but is it worthy of these epic passions like out of Africa? Maybe not. I don't know. This has been fun. It was really nice when our one of our illustrious compatriots at InSession Film, Mr. Jay Ledbetter, he gave us some nice praise on Twitter, saying that we're always so passionate and have such enjoyable intellectual.
Is that Jay Ledbetter or Brendan Cassidy?
Oh, was it Jay or was it Brendan?
I think it's Brendan.
Oh my!
Sorry. Sorry, I just want to properly credit the person who wrote.
We're getting so much love, I can't keep track of who it is right now. Mr. Brendan Cassidy was very kind, our fellow at InSessionFilm.com. He said that we have such passion and enjoyable intellectual conversations, and I thought, is he talking about us? But thank you. It's very nice when we get all kinds of different likes and shares and retweets. It's very touching. We have lots of topics to discuss. I guess we'll be dabbling into more classics and maybe some Oscar discourse in the future. Zita, what are you doing at the 300 Passions podcast?
Well, at the moment, I'm looking at a couple of mid-70s classics. It's a very odd period in film history, especially in terms of that genre. And we're going to be talking about Bloom in Love, the Paul Mazursky depressive comedy about what happens when you cheat on your wife and she divorces you.
Are you still writing all the different 100 Passions list at InSessionFilm.com?
Yes, I'm trying to keep up with those.
Well, it's a big list.
It is.
Eventually you'll finish it someday. That's fine.
Yes.
Zita_shorts is where we can find you on Twitter and at the 300 Passions podcast. And you have written your material at InSessionFilm.com. I am at Therefore Review. I've not written anything about Sydney Pollack. I probably should write something about Tootsie, but then I'll probably forget. when I'm too busy writing horror stuff in the middle of March, right? You can also actually, you can follow at InSession Film on Twitter. We may end up having some schedule changes. We're usually every week on the weekends, but as holiday things are coming around, as these award things are all happening, you may end up, seeing some disruption in the schedule, but never fear, we're still here. We've got too many women with too many things to discuss. So at InSession Film is where you can find us. And you can also follow the flagship podcast over on YouTube now as well. They have a Patreon, and it's really amazing. As I said, like, we get excited when we get love. I don't think we want anybody to comment negatively. We like being Shadon Larkey, Shadon and Erica. They're at the South by Southwest Festival, so hopefully we'll get some exciting coverage from them in the future too. It's nice when we're in our own little bubble, just being able to discuss film. But we love having you, dear listeners. So thank you for listening, and we'll see you at the next Women in Session.